thank you for having us here today, and it's something that Peter and I love to talk about, which is limited equity housing co-ops. And we hope that you'll ask lots of questions and learn what it is that you're interested in, as opposed to just what it is that we want to tell you. But you have about 50 years of experience developing limited equity co-ops, mostly in New York, but we've been working around the country to do that. And so we've come to understand that when you're from New York City, that people will say, well, that's New York City. Oh, that's New York, is usually the comment. But in fact, we've done co-ops over 1,000 times. We have over 1,300 co-ops that we've worked with. So we believe there's some learning from our experience. There's no other place in the country like New York, but I think there's a lot of experience and things that we can say that I believe have value and would help and support other people being able to develop co-ops around the nation. And we're particularly interested in and excited about talking today because this is focusing on more on rural, and we've spent most of our work on urban co-ops, as you'll see as we go along. Whoops. So now, how do we make this move? There. Okay, we'll do it that way. So let's get started. So the first issue is that we're talking to a group that deals with co-ops. So this part of what our presentation, where this is often very difficult to explain, I hope that we don't, and it's exciting not to have to do this in this one. But co-op is sort of a corporation instituted organization that's owned by its members, and it is ruled by 7 principles. And we always like to review these, but we're going to do it very quickly. And so we have open membership and democratic control, one of our favorites, economic participation, autonomy and independence. Education is a big part of what we do, and I'm sure a big part of what you guys do. Cooperation among cooperatives is really this kind of work. We often label under our 6th principle coalition that we're part of. It comes out of this one, and concern for community, which as a nonprofit is at the heart of our work. But now what we want to talk about today is what is a housing co-op. And that may be something that not all of you are familiar with. So a housing co-op is, like any other organization, a corporation that is a legal entity. And in this case, it's owning these 3 buildings in a row of tenement buildings in the Lower East Side of New York City. And it's called the 167-69 Avenue C Housing Development Fund Corporation, a particular kind of co-op corporation that we create. So what is a housing co-op? In our case, that the cooperative corporation owns the real estate, as opposed to an individual's owning it as a home, or a landlord, or some other corporation. And in the case of limited equity co-op, each resident owns a share of stock in their corporation, or several shares of stock, and that entitles them to a lease to their apartment. In New York, we call them proprietary leases, and a lot of other places. And that is what allows them to occupy their own unit. So they don't actually own their unit. They are a tenant in a corporation that they own. So they are their own landlord. And then there is democratic control. Each household gets a vote to elect a board of directors, and the board of directors sets policy and runs the corporation for that year, and there's elections usually annually for board members. In smaller co-ops, everybody is a member of the board, and so it avoids having the election issue each year. Okay, so what is there are any questions yet? So what is particular a limited equity co-op? What do we mean by that? So in a limited equity co-op, our goal is affordability. We're really anxious for people who have been left out of the housing market, been left out of home ownership, just can't afford a place to live in New York City and everywhere else we work, is to make housing affordable and make home ownership affordable. So we do this first by limiting the initial sales price, making that affordable. So to buy your shares of stock that entitles you to your lease is affordable. And then when you go to sell it, it is sold at a similar price, affordable to people in similar needs, so that it keeps affordable not only for you, but for future generations. And that's one of the things that makes this such a wonderful space to work in, this limited equity co-ops. And the other thing that limited equity co-ops typically have are income guidelines. So not only is it affordable, so low income or very low income households could afford to buy it, but often it's limited to the households below a certain income. And this ensures that, you know, as we're spending lots of tax dollars and subsidy dollars in this housing, that it's serving the communities that it's intended to serve. So we do that. So I think a little bit about, so how do we do that financially, and a very little bit about financing, and we'll go into more if people have questions. So your typical single family house, you put down your 20% equity, you go out to the bank or the local credit union, and you get a home loan, and you buy your home. And so you have 20% equity and 80% debt. For condominiums, often you'll have, it's like lots of little single family homes next to each other. You buy your unit. Your unit is actually carved out of the big one. You can own it into the middle of the walls. That's your unit, and you put down some equity, a down payment in varying amounts, and you get a loan to buy your condominium. The ground under the condominium, the public spaces, the parking lots, the swimming pool, whatever is included in your condominium, those are owned jointly by all the homeowners, by the homeowner association, the condominium association. But a limited equity co-op, how does a limited equity co-op work? So in a limited equity, you have your down payment, which is limited to what you can afford. You have an underlying mortgage down here, the blanket debt. So it's not individual debt. It's not debt that's placed on each unit. It is debt that's placed on a whole building. So when we go other places and we talk to cities and lenders and developers, we say it's financed just like you finance a rental building. You put the debt on the whole structure. It's the real estate that qualifies for the debt, not the individuals. The individuals only have to qualify for their limited equity portion, which can be a few $100s or a few $1,000s, but maybe a little bit more than that. And then in the middle is the shared equity. And the shared equity we don't have to pay for. That's sort of what belongs to the community. It's what makes it affordable for the individuals. It's what over time, a little bit of that each time it's resold might come back to the co-op to help it meet its reserve needs and so forth. And it's what keeps the building and the co-op affordable for future residents. Is the affordability is taken out of the equation essentially. And what the limited equity buyers have to pay for is only their limited equity. And then as part of their monthly payments, they repay this debt. So this is how we make what would be make something affordable about from something that might be less affordable.
And that affordability initially is grants and other money, from different levels of government frequently that, are what make it affordable originally. And part of what the model is that stays in as affordability and actually grows over time as the building's value grows. The limited equity and the debt don't grow, so that's how it remains affordable over time.
Right. So as your neighborhood gets gentrified, gets more expensive, as your town increases in value, this affordability part may grow, but you aren't charging people for it. It's not in what you have to pay for. So we can just continue paying for the affordability. So a little bit about who we are, and as a way to explain how the different ways in which we've done housing over the years. And so UHAB primarily does housing co-ops. We help people take over their housing. We help them turn it into co-ops, and we do that. But we also organize buildings that are struggling with landlords who aren't providing services, and with predatory investors who are trying to buy up buildings and convert them to market rate and push out existing residents and all of that. So we do have an organizing component, and we sort of see building strong tenant associations is very much like building a empowered cooperative. And so we do both activities, and many of or some of our co-ops come out of our organizing work. Buildings are struggling with a landlord, and sometimes they get a chance to buy their building. So we started in 1973, and it was a time when New York City was going through abandonment. The city, was losing huge swaths of its real estate, both to urban renewal, something that was sort of a self-inflicted gutting out of neighborhoods, and to abandonment by landlords. Abandonment was a very insidious kind of activity. Landlords collected rent, didn't provide services, and very often, at least in the early days, on the way out of completely walking away from a building, somehow it would catch fire, and a fire insurance settlement was received on the way out, and then the building was abandoned, became emptied. The city, in response to this, took over the building if landlords didn't pay their taxes. And so they would wait 10 years and 5 years, and then they would take over the building. Very often they would close up the building, consolidate residents into other buildings, knock down the building, and just have a rubble-strewn, fenced, vacant lot. And this is what many of New York City's neighborhoods look like in this period of time. Into this came the original founders of UHAB with the idea that these neighborhoods, despite the difficulty they were having, were places where people lived, where they grew up, they went to school, they got married, they had businesses, their families were there. These were neighborhoods that people treasured, and people would fight to save their neighborhood. And rather than bulldozing it, the idea was to sort of patch up the holes in the fabric and save the neighborhood. And the people who started UHAB, a guy named Don Turner was sort of the inspiration, T-E-R-N-E-R, had this notion, and he always talked about notions. I found it a nice way to describe it, that people could and would and should sort of get involved in doing this, and that they would fix up their own housing. So our earliest projects were sweat equity, urban homesteading. And my predecessors as executive director, although now I am retired, former executive director, claimed to have invented the word sweat equity. And now and sort of urban homesteading was something we did in New York. If you look in the corner of this picture away on the right side, that's the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in the world. That's where we were founded. The dean and the bishop were the others of our founders, and they were on our board, and in fact, some of the earliest staff members of UHAB lived on the grounds of the cathedral. It was a great place to have an office amongst all that Gothic splendor. So anyways, that's where we started. And so our first projects were homesteading ones. People would take over their buildings, they'd clean them out, they'd fix them up. They do a lot of their labor themselves, and then they would get licensed professionals for the trades that had to be done that way. And they would then own their buildings as a co-op. And the opportunity to do sweat equity, to do homesteading, was sort of a teachable moment, a time when people could really learn to be a strong organization, how to have leadership, how to have responsibility and accountability, and how to make decisions and move forward. And it was really a great way to build a strong co-op. And so there were hundreds of tenants in probably 100 or 200 buildings that got to be co-ops through this kind of program. Our next set of buildings, the city continued to have abandonment through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. But in the 70s in particular, the city went from waiting 10 years to foreclose on a landlord to 5 to 3. In 1978, they shortened it to 1. In 1978, the city took 11,000 buildings from their landlords. The average building in New York is 20 units. So you can do the math. It's the size of a small city. And because they were only waiting a year to take buildings, 4,000 of those buildings were still occupied. And so it was an enormous management problem. And we and other nonprofits from around the city, local elected officials, and residents living in these buildings went to the city and say, hey, why don't you let us lease the building and run it ourselves and eventually fix it up and own it as a co-op? Why don't we let community groups lease the building, fix it up, and eventually help the tenants own it as a co-op? Why don't we let, court-appointed administrators run the building, get it fixed up, and let the tenants become co-ops? And so a program was created, the Division of Alternative Management, a number of programs, including the tenant interim lease. You lease your building, you run it. The city eventually gets around to doing capital repairs, and then you buy your building as a co-op when the repairs are done. About 1,000 buildings went through these programs and became co-ops. About 25,000 residents, households got to buy their buildings through this program. And through this was when the city created the program. They hired the executive director of UHAB to run it. Everybody at UHAB moved up a little bit to fill the positions going up. And they made a phone call, because I was working for the founder of UHAB at that time in California, in Sacramento. And they said, we have this job. Do you know anybody who might want it? And I'd say, I'll take this job. Prop 13 had just passed. And so in 1978, I left California and went to New York City and have been here ever since. I've only really had one job in my life, which was this one. So we went through and we did these hundreds and thousands of buildings, and our first training programs for these buildings. 10 buildings came in the first month, and then 20 came the next month. By the end of the year, there were 200 buildings that had signed up for the program. We created curriculums and training and had the ability to go out and give technical assistance. But then it came time for, we had a new mayor, Mayor Giuliani, and he decided that the city shouldn't be in the business of owning and then giving out housing. And he stopped the city taking buildings, and he started having programs to give the buildings that the city owned or would take to private developers. And so at that point, we stepped up and said, nobody's going to create co-ops if we don't do it. And so UAB actually became a developer of buildings. And through that, over the last 2 decades, we've created 54 co-ops and about 10 affordable rentals out of buildings where in the end, the residents didn't want to be a co-op. And that represents about 100 buildings that were turned into co-ops through this development process. In these, it wasn't the city that fixed up the buildings, but we hired contractors and developers and managers and everybody, and it was a regular development process to turn these buildings into co-ops. We've had some other sources of buildings. City's Housing Authority owned some buildings that were given to it when the city was taking buildings, and the Housing Authority doesn't like what they call non-standard buildings. They don't have the same plumbing as every other building. They don't have the same doors and windows. They like all of their hundreds of thousands of units to be identical. So they were happy when President Bush wanted to privatize and wanted public housing units to say, okay, we'll take these non-standard units, we'll fix them up, we'll move Housing Authority residents who would like to be homeowners into them, and we'll create co-ops. And so that's what they did, and they hired us to do the training and the legal documents and help. And it was a program that was supposed to keep going and going because they had lots of city-owned buildings, and they thought that the pressure to get rid of Housing Authority units would keep going. So they would just take more city-owned buildings, fix them up, be able to move families who wanted to move from public housing and become homeowners out, and be able to then move new families into those now freed up public housing units from the waiting list. And so we did about 350 units in 3 or 4 developments across the city. It's this Housing Authority no longer does that, but it was a really, I thought it was a good response to the pressure on the Housing Authority.
Andy, we've got a question too. Did
Okay.
the UHAB ever do new construction?
Here we go. Not really. I went to architecture school, and that's where I met Don Turner, as he was a professor in the architecture school, and then I went to Sacramento when he became Jerry Brown's head of housing in the first Jerry Brown administration. As an architect, I always wanted to do something that was flat and square. And of all the buildings, we've probably done 2 new construction co-ops, this being one of them, and one in Midtown is another. And they were done under what's called inclusionary zoning. Some of New York City's neighborhoods are incredibly valuable. The real estate is just unbelievable, and particularly in the boom before the recession, the values were incredibly high. And the city had a program where they could voluntarily agree to make 20% of their units affordable in exchange for being able to make the building 30% bigger, essentially. So they got 10% extra luxury units by building 20% of the building as affordable. And so we actually owned a squatter building, a building that we were going to rehab quite minimally on this site, along with some other buildings that were on the site. And the owner came to us and said, "Can I buy your air rights?" And then when we looked at it, we said, "No, you don't want our air rights. You want our whole building. Just take our building. We had 8 residents that we were going to rehab the building for. We ended up with 13 affordable apartments in this luxury rental building. So there are 13 residents that bought their apartments in this building, randomly spread around. They're all the same as everyone else's, for $10. That was their full equity investment. They, at the time, they paid $600 a month to live there, and the renters were paying $3,600 to $4,000 a month for the same apartment. And so it was a great deal for them. And and I was a little scared when I went to them and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to trade your building for 13 apartments in this new building. And they looked at me and they said, will there be an elevator? And I said, yes. And they said, you mean we won't have to walk up 5 flights of stairs to our apartments any longer? And I says, that's correct. They said, great idea, let's do it. And so anyways, this went forward. So we've done this one. This one is mixed. The inclusionary units are in the building. We built an 18-story or 19-story, 18-unit co-op in Midtown Manhattan on Madison Avenue that has commercial on the ground floor and 18 units, one on a floor. It's a very narrow 18-story building. And that one is separate from the luxury housing, which was a few blocks away. And so they have this cute little co-op with a ground floor commercial, elevator stops in each apartment. You're the only one on each floor. And then we did 2 other buildings as renovations where the developer renovated 25 units in 2 buildings as the 20% of the square footage and got to build the extra square footage on a luxury development that was nearby, not far from this building we have in the picture. So those are the ones we have done. When there's gentrification, it was a great way to pay for it. So creating co-ops is sort of partly what we do, but co-ops are really, and housing is really not the development part. It's not the finance. It's not the millions of dollars. It's not the bricks and mortar. It's not the sort of things that make architects happy. But it's really the next 50 years when people move into their buildings and live there. And so we really focus, and we always have to remind ourselves that doing development is exciting, but in fact, housing has to do with people and people living in the buildings for generation after generation. And so that's a big part of what we do is to figure out how to support the buildings once they're created. And it is an essential ingredient if you're going to ever think about creating a co-op. You just can't walk away and say, wasn't that great? Here's your building, here's the keys, here's where the boiler turns on and off. When you need heat, good luck. You need to be there to train new board members, to deal with emergencies, to help them 20 years later when they need a new roof, or to help make sure they're living up to the requirements and the regulations that their building was created under. So we always need to remember that co-op development is people development. So do we have any lingering questions? Or you're on mute.
Okay, let's try this again. We had a question come in just a bit ago. Is there a way to have a portion of the units targeted to transitional housing, like homeless to housed or re-entered individuals, and the remainder of the units open to others that meet the membership criteria?
A number of buildings have sort of requirements on who might live there when you're filling vacancies. And so it's possible, but you're really creating 2 separate developments, even if they're in the same building. If you don't figure out a way for everybody to be a homeowner. So we sometimes have different income levels, although everybody pays the same amount each month. The purchase prices can be different so that people at higher incomes might purchase their units at higher prices. But to have a successful co-op, you want everybody sort of to be in there to pay their fair share of the monthly housing costs. The nice thing about the way that we finance co-ops, in that there's a blanket mortgage and that a co-op member is really a renter in their own corporation, is that they can get the same housing vouchers, the Section 8 vouchers or state subsidies, as other people. So as long as folks can afford it and you're going to include them in the membership, I think you can include everybody in that and have people coming out of homelessness who are ready to buy, and you have to educate and support them to do the home ownership the way you have to support and educate everybody to become a homeowner. That should work well. But if you're going to create a different kind of rental housing in a building and then have a co-op, then you have two different developments in one, and you have to figure out how to work together and so forth, but they would be different.
Yeah, we also had another question come in. Eric was wondering if member tenants' equity can be passed on to their heirs at death, and what if their heirs live in another state or a city?
It's always a controversial subject, and passing on the value of your apartment is not a problem. You leave your shares of stock, your apartment to your heirs, and they are entitled to the value. When it gets sold, the limited equity formula usually be it's what you paid, and in ours, generally we have a chart that we start out with at the beginning of the co-op. It usually goes out for 40 years, and the price increases 3% a year, which is what we have calculated over the past 27, 30 years, that low incomes have gone up each year, so that somebody at a same AMI would be able to afford it 10 years from now on that price, and you'll get 3% return on the equity that you put in. So that's what you do. So that's the value. The right to live there often is restricted to people who income qualify. So if you're not an adult child living in the apartment at the time that the parents are deceased, or an adult, niece or nephew or whatever, or actually a mother or father, but a family member who's still living there in the apartment, then you can inherit the shares and the right to live there. You're on the lease. But if you're not living there, then you would have to qualify. Your income would have to qualify if there's income restrictions on that co-op.
Frequently, that does work out, that adult children take over the co-op unit from their parent, but that assumes they haven't gotten way higher income and no longer would qualify. But frequently they do.
Right. Co-ops really like to have the kids that grew up there come back and move into their units, so they extend themselves to try to get them to live there.
One other question to you fellas. What about individual development accounts? Can they be used to meet equity contributions?
Most definitely. And we've seen, as we've been hearing from cities around the country and towns and counties and everything, often a credit union shows up along with a local nonprofit organization, and the credit union says, I want to be part of this. These are my people. I want to help people save. We could do these individual development accounts for this. And so it's a great way to actually get. Currently in New York, when we first started, the insider price, the price for somebody living in the co-op was $250. That was the average auction price when the city was just taking the buildings and selling them off at auction, was $250. So you live in a building, you went through that tenant interim lease program, you came out the other end, you paid $250. In recent years, the city raised it to $2,500. So that's what you pay. And then the outsider price for a vacancy in the building after it's a co-op may be 15,000 or 25,000, could be a higher price. And so that's what outsiders would pay. And so that insider price makes sure that everybody who lives in the building can afford it. And so that amount for the insiders is very low, but for the outsiders, having that help from a credit union who can both make the down payment and could, with an IDA, as well as be able to make a share loan so that somebody could borrow, $20,000 to afford a unit in the co-op is a really wonderful thing. We are a lender ourselves for share loans to make sure that this can happen. Our local social service agency will actually put down the $2,500 to help somebody who's on public assistance be able to afford to buy their unit. And they'll just hold the shares of stock. And if they sell it in the future, they're required to pay back the $2,500 to the social service agency. So they really encourage people to be able to stay and purchase and so forth in their unit.
Andy, did you see we have 15 minutes?
Oh, no. That's your job to yell at me. So let's move on quickly, and I'm going to say very quickly. So we've just to give you a sense of the national landscape. For many years, people talked about the fact that there were 425,000 units of limited equity co-op, and we actually got a grant to go out and figure out if that was true. And we went and looked at what they had said was going to be the 425,000 units and discovered that it was a projection and not reality. And we knew immediately that it was because, in fact, they said we were going to do 50,000. We had only done 33,000 units. So we knew there was a mistake. And as you can see, what was thought to be the production and what actually happened was that. But to our disappointment, one of the things that we discovered is half of those units were under HUD mortgages and insurance, and the restrictions that keep them affordable and when the mortgage is paid off or the insurance is done. And so we ended up with there being only about 160,000 units of limited equity co-ops left in the United States at the time we were doing this, which was about, I don't know, 7 years ago or something. The other things we discovered that would affect the rural areas is that Farmers Home was expected to produce a lot of units, but in fact, we only could find very few, although our counting is not necessarily accurate. And so these are all over the place. They're all over the country. And so here's where they are. There's also Canada has a whole production system, and theirs are zero equity. You just pay, a nominal amount to get in, a membership fee, and you get the same when you leave. You don't get to increase your equity. And then there are community land trust units across the nation. And this map is a little old, but it's increased. So here is the spread of sort of co-ops where they exist. And they come in all sorts of sizes and ages and so forth. This is the first limited equity co-op, maybe in the United States, but certainly in New York. It was 1927, 24, actually, I believe. It no longer exists, but they went out of business after the Depression in order to not raise their carrying charges so that the landlords on the same neighborhood wouldn't raise the rents on their neighbors. And so but it was an early early one, and you could see their political affiliation above their doorway. But it's the 1920s. This is the oldest existing one we know of, amalgamated houses, 1,500 units built over quite a period of time. And it still exists today and still is providing affordable housing. It was dedicated by FDR when he was governor of New York. Then we have the Lower East Side. There's 10,000 units of co-ops that were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the Lower East Side. And if this picture went a little bit farther down to the left, I live in a little 20-unit co-op that's just outside this picture frame on the Lower East Side. There is Penn South, which was built in the 60s and dedicated by President Kennedy. And it's just south of Penn Station. It's 2,600 units. And then we have the granddaddy, or the big one of them all, 1,500 units, 15,000 units, 65,000 people living in Co-op City in the Bronx. It is giant. And their co-ops sort of embody all sorts of architectural forms and all sorts of HUD financing. Everything imaginable that has come through the federal and state governments has been used to build co-ops. And there used to be thousands of them in the United States, but co-ops come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So we have student co-ops in Seattle. We have larger co-ops in Chicago. We have Washington, DC. We have Jonesboro, Georgia. We have Michigan and New Mexico. Oop, I'm echoing. Pittsburgh, Davis, California, Seattle, Washington, and San Francisco. There's my little button. San Francisco, and even in South Bend, Indiana. So from single family collections of single family homes to 15,000 units, co-ops can be any shape, size that you can imagine. So do we have any more questions?
We actually had one come through. Do many limited equity housing co-ops pay patronage for tenant members? And how do you make sure the income does not push some tenants past income-based eligibility limits?
Limited equity housing co-ops don't pay patronage. The surpluses go into reserves or would be credited to the next year. When you go, every year you do a budget to figure out what it's going to cost to run your building. And so if there's a surplus this year, you could start this year, if your reserves are adequate, with some extra cash, which would mean you might not raise them so much the following year. But we actually recommend to all of our co-ops that they raise their monthly charges 2% every year, whether they need it or not, because it avoids moments like now when inflation has driven up the cost of fuel and insurance and everything to really high levels, and so that co-ops can cover those costs. So patronage is not part of a co-op. You get a return on your equity, a limited return when you sell your unit, and otherwise you enjoy the surpluses as reserves and lower monthly costs. Okay. So very briefly is a little bit about, and I'll go through these extremely fast and we can send you the slides. the big part about doing a co-op, as I said, is not the development, is what comes next. And what we've learned over 50 years is you need to build an ecosystem, a structure, infrastructure to do this and to provide stewardship to your co-ops. So we have training, member services, we have co-op preservation, helping co-ops meet their needs over time. We have making sure they live up to their regulatory agreements and are meeting their income guidelines and sales prices and so forth. And then we do the lending, and then we share the best practices like we're doing today. So on the member services, you can see all that insurance we buy as a group, we do bookkeeping electronically, we buy fuel as a group, we help people sell their apartments and make sure people know about it, and we do ongoing training for certain items. We have what we call co-op preservation, where we help people with their budgets and elections. We help send the annual reports to the state or the city. We help people get loans when they need a new roof, when they want to do other things, if they want to do solar, all those kind of things. And then any question that comes in about anything that they're doing, internal disputes or repair needs or going to court or those. We have training programs, which include training of new members, ongoing training for board members and for new board members. We have seminars on special topics from when they're building a building next door and they break your foundation to, how do we do with solar energy? And then sort of as a graduate program for active leaders and so forth, or people who want to get on boards, occasionally we run something we call UAB University, a 13 session certificate program where people can learn sort of in detail and learn from each other how to run their buildings. Anyways, so those are a lot of our preservation things. So now's your chance for any last question, because I probably run us right into our.
There's a question about difference of a land trust and a housing co-op. And a housing co-op, of course, is owned by the members who live there. But the difference to the land trust is a land trust is owned by a combination of people who live on the land of the land trust and some other community members, and then frequently a sort of more professional class of members. And the idea is it will be something that can keep the land affordable and however it's used over coming generations. And actually having a co-op on the land trust is something we are seeing increasingly, that the land trust owns the land under the co-op and the co-op then owns the building. And this is a way to provide some of that stewardship over time for, because the land trust might own land under several co-ops and can then do training for all of them and gets a little money each year from the land lease, typically a 99-year lease, that can help with that, pay for that stewardship.
Right. Yeah. The land trusts are getting to be an increasingly important part of creating limited equity co-ops. And in part, our co-ops, for the most part, have a 40-year regulatory agreement that keeps them affordable, although the way they're incorporated, they have to remain affordable forever, but there's no rules or regulations. But the city's rules run out in 40 years. So the land trust can that uncertainty is answered by the land lease and the rules that the land trust can provide at the end of the 40 years. But it's also important to note that the cost of stewardship, the cost of having a group like you have or the land trust or whatever, needs to be built into the affordability of a co-op when it's created. You need to know that you're going to be spending $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000, whatever it is, a year on stewardship, on getting assistance with your budget, on elections, on having training programs, on all those things, so that it doesn't make the co-op unaffordable when they need to do it or when they're required to have it. So we really emphasize that building the cost of stewardship into the co-op as affordable, and not as an add-on after you have finished it, is an important feature when you do development.
Andy, what happens if a tenant rises above the original income limit?
We only check incomes for incoming members, and we hope that everybody rises above the income limits over time. When they sell, they will sell to somebody within the income limits. So we have our 33,000 units or whatever of co-ops in New York City. There is another set of much older co-ops, some of which you saw, the Mitchell-Lama co-ops in general. And they have a system where they do check people's incomes each year. And so you pay a certain a monthly charge, sort of the rent equivalent, each month when you live in one of those co-ops. If your income goes over a certain level, or if you refuse to submit your income, you go up, you get a surcharge. You pay some extra. It's not unaffordable, it's not huge, and it's only one number, doesn't depend upon your income, but it is a way in which people who have higher incomes are able to pay more, do pay more, and it helps the co-op remain more affordable that way as people's incomes go up. So having but that's built into the enabling legislation that created those co-ops. It's not a feature in our co-ops. So
Great.